Yellowstone National Park always felt like magic to Emily. At just 12 years old, she had an artistic soul, an eye for nature's beauty, and a passion for sketching everything she saw. For Emily, who had spent most of her life using a wheelchair due to a neuromuscular disorder, the park offered a rare sense of wonder. It wasn't about what she couldn't do. It was about everything she could experience. The towering trees, bubbling geysers, and shimmering hot springs spoke to her in ways no one else could understand. Every summer, Emily's parents, Sarah and James, packed up the family car for their annual trip to Yellowstone. This year was no different. Along with them was their loyal golden retriever, Baxter, whose boundless energy and friendly demeanor made him Emily's perfect companion. Sarah, a biology teacher, saw these trips as a way to share her love of wildlife with her daughter, while James, a former architect, appreciated the quiet majesty of the park's landscapes. Together, the three of them, and Baxter, shared a love for this wild, untouched corner of the world. The drive to Yellowstone was long, but filled with excitement. Emily sat in the back seat, her sketchbook balanced on her lap, drawing quick sketches of the rolling hills and wildflowers they passed along the way. Sarah, ever the teacher, pointed out interesting sights, a hawk soaring high above or a cluster of lupins blooming by the roadside. "Look at that! Isn't it beautiful?" she'd exclaim, her enthusiasm contagious. Baxter, lying beside Emily, would occasionally lift his head, his tail thumping against the seat whenever he caught sight of something interesting. When they arrived at the park's entrance, Emily felt a familiar thrill. The fresh pine-scented air, the distant sound of rushing water, and the sight of endless green meadows. It was as if the world opened up just for her. While James unloaded the car, Sarah grabbed Emily's sketchpad and art supplies, tucking them into her daughter's bag. "Ready to go, kiddo?" she asked, her voice warm. Emily nodded eagerly, her fingers already itching to start drawing. Their first stop was the visitor center. Emily loved collecting maps from each trip, marking the trails they'd taken in previous years, and planning which spots to explore next. This summer, she had one goal: to capture the vibrant colors of the grand prismatic spring in her sketchbook. She'd tried before, but something had always felt incomplete. This time, she was determined to get it right. As they made their way along the park's trails, James pushed Emily's wheelchair, carefully navigating the uneven paths. "Let me know if you see anything that catches your eye," he said, his voice calm and steady. Sarah walked ahead, her binoculars swinging around her neck as she scanned the trees for wildlife. Baxter, trotting happily beside Emily, occasionally veered off the path to sniff at an interesting patch of grass or bark at a squirrel. The family's first stop was a scenic meadow dotted with wildflowers. Emily leaned forward in her wheelchair, her eyes scanning the landscape for inspiration. She noticed the way the sunlight hit a cluster of Indian paintbrush flowers, making their red petals seem to glow. "Can we stop here for a bit?" she asked, already reaching for her sketchbook. "Of course," James said, setting the wheelchair's brakes as Sarah knelt beside her. Emily's pencil moved quickly, her hands deftly capturing the scene before her. She didn't just draw what she saw, she drew how it made her feel. The flowers seemed to dance on the page, their stems bending in a breeze that Emily could almost feel. Baxter lay down beside her, his head resting on his paws as if he were admiring her work. "You've got a great sense of perspective," James said, leaning over to watch her sketch. Emily smiled, her earlier nervousness melting away. She didn't always feel confident in her abilities, but moments like this reminded her of why she loved drawing so much. As they continued their journey, Emily's enthusiasm grew. Each turn of the trail brought something new to sketch: a lone bison grazing in a meadow, the gnarled branches of an ancient tree, or the delicate wings of a butterfly resting on a wildflower. Sarah and James were patient, stopping whenever Emily wanted to capture something. Even when the trail grew crowded, they found ways to make her feel like she was at the center of the experience. But not everything was perfect. When they arrived at the grand prismatic spring, Emily's excitement was dampened by the sheer number of people crowded onto the boardwalk. Tourists jostled for space, some oblivious to the young girl in the wheelchair trying to navigate through. "Excuse us," Sarah said politely as she guided the wheelchair along the path. A group of teenagers posing for selfies barely acknowledged them, forcing James to steer Emily around them. By the time they reached a quieter spot, Emily's frustration was palpable. She stared at the spring's vibrant colors, blues, oranges, and yellows swirling like a living painting. But her sketchbook remained closed on her lap. "Do you want to draw for a bit?" James asked gently. "I don't feel like it," Emily muttered, her arms crossed. Even Baxter, sitting attentively by her side, couldn't lift her spirits. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, her hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder. "I know it's hard sometimes," she said softly, "but don't let those little moments ruin the big picture. Remember why we come here, what this place means to you." Emily sighed, her fingers twitching toward her sketchbook. Slowly, she opened it and began to draw. At first, her lines were tentative, hesitant, but as she focused, the world around her seemed to fade. The crowd, the noise, the earlier frustrations, all of it disappeared. Her pencil moved with purpose, capturing not just the spring's colors, but its energy, its life. James and Sarah watched silently as their daughter transformed the blank page into a masterpiece. Baxter lay down beside her, his tail wagging gently as if in approval. By the time Emily finished, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. She held up the sketch for her parents to see, her face glowing with pride. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. "You've really outdone yourself this time." James nodded in agreement. "I think this might be your best work yet." Emily smiled, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. She looked out at the spring one last time, the colors even more vivid in the fading light. For the first time all day, she felt at peace. As the family continued their walk, Emily kept her sketchbook open on her lap, glancing down at her drawing every now and then. Yellowstone had given her more than just inspiration. It had given her a sense of belonging. And for now, that was all she needed. After the mesmerizing experience at the Grand Prismatic Spring, Emily and her family decided to continue exploring the quieter trails of Yellowstone. The encounter with the crowds had been frustrating, but Emily's mood had improved after completing her sketch. Her parents, Sarah and James, suggested moving away from the bustling boardwalks to find a more peaceful path through the forest. Emily eagerly agreed, eager to dive deeper into the tranquility of the park. With her sketchbook tucked safely under her arm and Baxter trotting faithfully beside her wheelchair, she was ready to see what the rest of the day would bring. The trail they chose meandered through a dense pine forest, its quiet broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of birds. James pushed Emily's wheelchair carefully along the even portions of the path while Sarah walked slightly ahead, her binoculars swinging from her neck as she scanned the trees for wildlife. Baxter was alert, his nose constantly sniffing the air, ready for whatever adventure might await them. "Do you think we'll see any animals here?" Emily asked, craning her neck to peer into the trees. She loved imagining what might be hiding just out of sight, deer, foxes, or maybe even a bear. The thought of a bear both thrilled and scared her. They were so powerful, so mysterious, and while she'd sketched them from photos many times, she'd never seen one in the wild. "Maybe," Sarah replied, smiling back at her daughter. "This is prime bear country after all. But remember, if we do see one, we keep our distance. Admire from afar." Emily nodded, her imagination already running wild. She pictured a grizzly lumbering through the forest, its fur shimmering in the sunlight. She thought about how she'd capture its majesty on paper, the curve of its powerful shoulders, the intelligence in its eyes. The trail eventually opened up into a wide meadow, the golden grass swaying gently in the wind. Wildflowers of every color dotted the landscape, creating a scene so picturesque that Emily couldn't resist reaching for her sketchbook. "This is perfect," she said, already flipping to a blank page. "Let's stop here for a bit," James suggested, setting the brakes on Emily's wheelchair. Sarah sat down on a nearby rock, pulling out a water bottle, while Baxter sniffed enthusiastically at a patch of flowers. Emily began to sketch, her pencil gliding effortlessly over the paper as she captured the rolling meadow and the distant line of trees. Her parents watched her with quiet pride, marveling at how their daughter could take something so vast and translate it onto a small page with such precision and emotion. Baxter settled down beside Emily, his head resting on his paws, his golden fur glinting in the sunlight. The moment felt perfect, almost too perfect. And then, without warning, Baxter lifted his head, his ears perking up. A low growl rumbled in his throat, breaking the stillness. Sarah and James immediately turned their attention to the dog, their faces tense with concern. "What is it, boy?" James asked, his voice low. Baxter didn't move, his gaze fixed on the edge of the meadow where the trees began. Emily followed his line of sight, her heart skipping a beat as she saw what he was staring at. A massive grizzly bear was emerging from the forest. Its presence was commanding, its hulking form moving with deliberate grace. The bear's fur was a rich brown, shimmering in the sunlight, and its sheer size was enough to make Emily's breath catch. It stopped at the edge of the meadow, lifting its nose to sniff the air. Then its eyes locked onto Emily. "Stay calm," James said quickly, his voice steady but filled with urgency. He placed a firm hand on Emily's shoulder. "Nobody move." Sarah instinctively stepped closer to Emily, her body partially shielding her daughter. Baxter's growl grew louder, but he stayed by Emily's side, his posture protective. Sarah whispered urgently, Baxter quiet. The bear, however, showed no aggression. It stood still, its massive paws sinking slightly into the soft earth, its gaze fixed on the small group. To Emily, it felt as though the bear wasn't just looking at them. It was looking at her, as though it could see straight into her soul. For a moment, fear gripped her. The bear was so close, so powerful. But as she stared back at it, something shifted. She didn't see a threat in its dark eyes. Instead, she saw curiosity, intelligence, even calmness. The fear melted away, replaced by a strange sense of connection. "Emily, don't move," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't," Emily replied softly. She raised her hand slowly, almost instinctively, her palm open as if reaching out to the bear. She wasn't sure why she did it. It was as though her body acted on its own. "Emily, no!" Sarah hissed, panic flooding her voice. But Emily didn't touch the bear. She couldn't, even if she wanted to. Instead, she held her hand steady, her gaze never leaving the bear's. The animal tilted its head slightly, as if studying her. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the two of them were locked in a silent exchange. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but not from fear. It was something else, an unexplainable feeling of understanding, of being seen. The bear let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh. Slowly, it turned away, its massive body moving back toward the forest. Within moments, it disappeared into the trees, leaving the meadow eerily quiet. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hand clutching her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God." James crouched down beside Emily, his hands on her arms as if to reassure himself that she was okay. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Emily nodded, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the bear had vanished. I think it liked me," she said softly. Sarah laughed nervously, her voice trembling. "Liked you?" "Emily, that was a grizzly bear. You're lucky it didn't." She stopped herself, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "You scared me half to death." James exchanged a look with Sarah, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "We need to head back," he said. "Let's get to the car." As they made their way back down the trail, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the bear. She could still see its eyes in her mind, deep and knowing, as though it had been trying to tell her something. The encounter had been terrifying, but it had also been extraordinary. She glanced down at her sketchbook, her fingers itching to draw what she had seen. But for once, she hesitated. How could she capture something so profound? Baxter walked close to her wheelchair, his tail wagging slightly, as if sensing her thoughts. Sarah and James kept glancing over their shoulders, their nerves still frayed. But Emily felt strangely calm, a peace settling over her that she couldn't explain. She didn't know what the encounter meant or why it had happened, but one thing was certain. It was a moment she would carry with her forever. The events of the previous day lingered heavily in Sarah and James' minds, casting a shadow over their otherwise peaceful evening at the campsite. After their encounter with the grizzly bear, both parents found themselves on edge, their thoughts cycling through worst-case scenarios. They double-checked the perimeter of the cabin they had rented, ensured all food was locked securely in the bear-proof container outside, and instructed Emily to avoid wandering too far, even if she was in her wheelchair. Bears don't just wander up to people like that, Sarah muttered as she closed the cabin's blinds, her voice tinged with unease. She glanced out at the darkening forest. It must have smelled something, or maybe it was curious. Whatever it was, James replied, placing his hand on her shoulder, we're not taking any chances. It's Yellowstone. Wildlife is unpredictable. Emily sat at the small dining table, her sketchbook open in front of her. She had been trying to recreate the moment when the bear had stood in the meadow, its eyes locked with hers. But no matter how many times she tried, she couldn't seem to capture the depth of the bear's expression. Her parents' whispered concerns filled the small cabin, but she tuned them out. She wasn't afraid of the bear. In fact, she felt the opposite. That brief, silent connection had left her with a sense of calm, even awe. It wasn't going to hurt us, Emily said suddenly, breaking the tension in the room. Her parents turned to her, startled. Sarah frowned. Emily, you don't know that. It's a wild animal. It could have done anything. Emily looked up from her sketchbook, her expression unwavering. I know, but I could feel it. It didn't want to hurt us. It was just curious. James sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her. Sweetie, I know it felt special to you, and I'm not saying it wasn't. But bears aren't pets or storybook creatures. They're dangerous, and we can't afford to treat them like anything else. Emily didn't argue. She could see the fear in her father's eyes, the protective instinct that made him wary of even acknowledging what she had felt. But deep down, she knew the bear wasn't dangerous. She just couldn't explain why. Instead of replying, she went back to her drawing, losing herself in the lines and shadows as the evening wore on. The night fell heavy and quiet over the cabin, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howl of a coyote breaking the stillness. Sarah and James eventually retired to bed, though neither of them slept easily. Emily, however, stayed up late, her sketchbook still on her lap as she watched the shadows flicker across the walls. Baxter dozed at her feet, his ears occasionally twitching at some faint noise beyond the cabin. It was just past midnight when Baxter stirred. His head shot up, and a low, throaty growl rumbled in his chest. Emily looked down at him, her heart quickening. What is it, boy? She whispered. The dog didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the window nearest the table. Emily's gaze followed his, and she froze. Outside, barely visible in the pale light of the moon, was the grizzly bear. It was closer than she could have imagined, its massive form looming just beyond the edge of the cabin's small porch. The bear's dark eyes shone in the moonlight as it peered toward the window, its breath visible in the cool night air. Emily's chest tightened, but not from fear. Once again, she felt that strange, unshakable calm, as though the bear's presence was meant to be. Mom, Dad, she called softly, not wanting to alarm the bear. Baxter stood, his growl growing louder. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Sarah appeared, her face pale. Emily, what's wrong? Her question trailed off as she followed her daughter's gaze. The blood drained from her face. James! James, wake up! What is it? James stumbled into the room, his eyes widening as he saw the bear. He grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at the window, the beam cutting through the darkness. The bear flinched slightly, but didn't retreat. Turn it off! Emily exclaimed, her voice sharp. Emily, it's right there, James hissed, his voice taut with panic. We need to scare it off. You'll scare it, Emily shot back. It's not going to hurt us. Just leave it alone. Sarah grabbed the flashlight from James and switched it off, her hands trembling. What do we do? She whispered. The bear, unfazed by the commotion inside the cabin, took a step closer to the porch. It lowered its massive head, sniffing the ground near the steps. Emily wheeled herself closer to the window, ignoring her parents' frantic whispers to stay back. "Emily, please," Sarah begged, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not safe." "It's okay," Emily said, her voice steady. She placed her hand on the glass, palm facing out. The bear lifted its head, its dark eyes meeting hers once more. For a moment, everything else faded. The cabin, her parents' panic, even Baxter's low growls. All that existed was the connection between the girl and the grizzly. Emily's breathing slowed as she stared into those deep, knowing eyes. The bear made a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something softer, almost like a hum. Sarah and James watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or trust their daughter's instincts. Baxter, though still tense, had stopped growling, his body pressed protectively against Emily's wheelchair. The bear stayed for what felt like an eternity, its gaze never wavering from Emily's. Then, slowly, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, its massive form disappearing into the shadows as silently as it had come. The cabin remained still for a long moment, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside. Sarah sank into a chair, her hands shaking. That just happened," she whispered. James ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." Emily turned back to her parents, her face calm but serious. "It wasn't dangerous," she said quietly. "It didn't come here to hurt us. It came back because it remembered me." "Emily," James began, his voice trembling, "you can't possibly know that." "I can," she insisted. "I felt it. It's not like other animals. It knows me." Her parents exchanged a look, one filled with fear and confusion. They didn't know how to argue with her, but they also couldn't accept what she was saying. James eventually sighed and sat down beside Sarah, pulling her into a reassuring embrace. "Let's just get some rest," he said quietly, though his tone made it clear he doubted rest would come easily. "We'll talk about it in the morning." Emily nodded, though she knew there was nothing left to say. As her parents retreated to their room, she stayed by the window, her hands still resting on the glass. The forest was quiet again, but she could feel the bear's presence lingering, as if it were still watching from somewhere unseen. She didn't know why the bear had come back or what it wanted, but she was certain of one thing: their connection was real, and it was only the beginning. The morning after the bear's second appearance was subdued. Sarah and James exchanged nervous glances over the small dining table in their cabin as they sipped their coffee, the events of the night before replaying in their minds like a bad dream. For them, it wasn't just the fear of a wild animal coming so close to their child. It was something deeper, a memory long buried that neither of them had spoken about for years. Emily, however, was in a much lighter mood. She sat at the table with her sketchbook, adding the finishing touches to a drawing of the bear she had started earlier. Despite the tension that still hung in the air, she felt calm, even exhilarated. To her, the bear wasn't a threat. It was a connection, a presence that brought with it a strange comfort she couldn't explain. "Did you sleep well, Emily?" James asked, breaking the silence. His voice was strained, an attempt to sound casual. She looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "I guess so," she said. "I was thinking about the bear. I don't know why it came back, but I don't think it wanted to hurt us." Sarah set her mug down with a heavy thud, her hands trembling slightly. "Emily, it's not about what it wanted," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "It's a wild animal. You can't trust it, no matter how it made you feel." "But it didn't act wild," Emily replied, her brow furrowing. "It could have hurt us, but it didn't. It just looked at me like it remembered me." Those words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her eyes flicked to James, who stared into his coffee as though it held answers he didn't want to confront. They had avoided this conversation for so long, burying it under layers of normalcy. But now it seemed inescapable. "Mom?" Emily pressed, noticing her mother's sudden silence. "What is it?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, glancing at James for support. He finally looked up, his expression somber. "Emily," he began slowly, "there's something we need to tell you." Emily set her sketchbook down, her heart starting to race. She could feel the weight in her father's voice, the kind that only came when something serious was about to be revealed. Baxter, sensing the tension, sat up from his spot near the door, his eyes darting between the family members. "What is it?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This isn't the first time a bear has approached you." Emily blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" "It happened when you were a baby," Sarah said, her voice tight. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles turning white. "We were on a hike. You were barely a year old." James picked up where she left off, his tone cautious. "We had just moved to Montana at the time. It was one of our first trips to Yellowstone. We wanted to take you on a short trail near a waterfall. We thought it'd be safe. It wasn't a long hike, and we had everything we needed." Emily leaned forward, hanging on her father's every word. "What happened?" she asked, her curiosity mixed with a hint of unease. James hesitated, his eyes darkening as he recalled the memory. "We had stopped for a break near a clearing. Your mom was holding you, and I was getting water from the pack when I saw it, a bear, maybe a little smaller than the one last night, walking out of the trees. It was heading straight for us." Sarah's breath hitched as she remembered the scene. "I froze," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was holding you, and all I could think was that we were about to lose you. It came so close, closer than we should have let it." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Did it do anything?" she asked tentatively. James shook his head. "No," he said, his voice distant. "It just stopped and stared at you. I don't know why, but it didn't seem interested in us at all. It just looked at you, as if it recognized you." Sarah nodded, her hands shaking. "You weren't crying or fussing," she added. "You just stared back at it, like you weren't afraid. It stood there for a while, and then it turned around and walked away." Emily was silent, her mind racing to piece together this startling revelation. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "We didn't know how," James admitted. "It felt strange, unnatural. And honestly, we didn't want to scare you. You were so young, and we didn't think it mattered. It was just an odd encounter. But now," Emily pressed, "do you think this is the same bear?" James shook his head. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It's been so many years. It's not likely. It can't be," Sarah said firmly, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. "Bears don't live that long, Emily. It's just a coincidence." Emily wasn't so sure. She thought back to the way the bear had looked at her, both in the meadow and at the cabin. There was something in its eyes, something familiar, as if it didn't know her. The idea seemed impossible, but then again, so did everything else about these encounters. "But why me?" she asked softly. "Why would a bear act like that around me, both then and now?" Her parents didn't have an answer. Sarah looked away, her jaw tightening, while James rubbed his temples, as if trying to think of a rational explanation where none existed. Baxter let out a soft whine, breaking the silence. Emily reached down to stroke his head, finding comfort in his familiar presence. Her mind buzzed with questions, but she could tell her parents were already at their limit. They were scared, uncertain, and perhaps even ashamed that they had kept this from her for so long. "I don't think it's just a coincidence," Emily said quietly, almost to herself. "There's something about it, something I can't explain, but I think the bear knows me." "Emily," Sarah began, her voice strained, "you're imagining things. It's just an animal." Emily looked up at her mother, her gaze steady. "I don't think it is," she said firmly. "You didn't see the way it looked at me." Her parents didn't argue, but their silence spoke volumes. They didn't know what to believe, and that uncertainty left them more uneasy than any clear danger ever could. For the rest of the day, the family stayed close to the cabin, avoiding the trails they had once eagerly explored. Sarah and James busied themselves with small tasks, though it was clear their thoughts were elsewhere. Emily, however, couldn't stop thinking about the story her parents had told her. It felt like a piece of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving, and now that it was in place, it only raised more questions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, Emily sat on the cabin's small porch, her sketchbook in her lap. Baxter lay at her feet, his ears twitching as he listened to the sounds of the night. Emily stared out into the darkening woods, her mind racing. She didn't know why the bear had come into her life. Not once, but twice. But deep down, she felt certain that it wasn't just chance. There was something tying them together, something she couldn't yet understand. And she was determined to find out what it was. The air was crisp and still the next morning, with the sun casting long golden rays through the dense pine forest surrounding the cabin. Emily hadn't slept much after the revelation her parents shared the night before. The idea that a bear had approached her as a baby felt both surreal and significant, as though it explained something she'd always felt but never understood. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a reason the bear kept appearing, and she was determined to find out what it was. Her parents, however, were in no mood for exploration. Sarah and James were still visibly shaken, the strain of the last few days etched into their faces. They hovered near the cabin, reluctant to let Emily out of their sight. Their vigilance was stifling, and Emily felt the weight of their fear pressing down on her. "Can I at least go out to sketch?" Emily asked at breakfast, her voice edged with impatience. James hesitated, his fork pausing midair. "Not far," he said firmly. "Just stay where we can see you." Emily nodded, knowing better than to argue. But as the morning wore on, the pull of the forest grew stronger. She didn't want to sit on the porch sketching the same trees and meadows she'd already drawn. She wanted to find the bear again. Her parents were busy tidying up the cabin when she decided to slip away. It wasn't hard. Sarah and James were distracted, their focus on making sure the food was secured in the bear-proof container. Baxter, always attuned to Emily's movements, followed her loyally as she maneuvered her wheelchair onto the trail that wound into the woods. The deeper she went into the forest, the quieter it became. The crunch of leaves under her wheels and Baxter's soft panting were the only sounds that broke the silence. Emily's heart raced, a mix of excitement and nervousness building with every turn of the trail. She didn't know if the bear would be there, but something deep inside told her she was on the right path. After about 15 minutes, she reached a small clearing. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Emily stopped, her hand tightening on the sketchbook resting in her lap. Baxter sniffed the air, his body tense but not alarmed. And then she saw it. The bear emerged from the shadows like a living embodiment of the wilderness. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its massive form both imposing and beautiful. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the bear stopped a few yards away, its dark eyes locking onto hers once again. "Hey," she said softly, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the bear or herself. Baxter growled low in his throat, but Emily reached down to calm him. "It's okay," she whispered, stroking his head. To her surprise, Baxter obeyed, though his body remained tense. The bear took a step closer, its gaze unwavering. Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't feel the paralyzing fear she thought she might. Instead, she felt the same sense of calm she had the night before, as though the bear's presence was meant to be. Carefully, Emily reached for her sketchbook. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped to a blank page and picked up her pencil. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, as if the bear needed reassurance. To her amazement, the bear didn't move away. It sat down, its massive body settling into the earth as it continued to watch her. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she began to sketch, her pencil moving quickly across the page. She had drawn bears before, but never like this. She wasn't just capturing the bear's form. She was capturing its essence, the quiet power and intelligence that radiated from its every movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the two of them remained locked in their strange, silent connection. Baxter lay at her feet, his growl fading into a quiet whimper as if he, too, could feel the peace in the air. Emily's focus deepened, her pencil strokes becoming more confident as the bear's image took shape on the page. "You're beautiful," she murmured, almost without realizing it. The bear blinked slowly, its ears twitching as though it understood her words. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Emily worked, completely absorbed in her sketch. She didn't notice the way the sunlight shifted or the chill creeping into the air. All that existed was the bear and the page in front of her. When she finally finished, She set the pencil down and looked up, her hands trembling with a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. The bear was still there, watching her with those deep, knowing eyes. Emily hesitated, then held up the sketchbook to show what she had drawn. "This is you," she said softly. "What do you think?" The bear didn't react in any obvious way, but something in its posture shifted, a subtle relaxation that made Emily feel as though it approved. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that she couldn't explain. But the moment was interrupted by a distant shout. "Emily!" It was James, his voice sharp with panic. Emily's stomach dropped. She knew her parents would be furious that she had wandered off, and the humiliation of being caught like this stung. She looked back at the bear, her heart sinking at the thought of leaving it. "Emily, where are you?" Sarah's voice joined James, closer now. The bear stood slowly, its massive frame towering over her once again. Emily's breath hitched as she watched it retreat, melting back into the shadows of the forest. "Wait," she whispered, but the bear didn't stop. Within moments, it was gone. Baxter barked, and Emily turned to see her parents running toward her, their faces pale and filled with fear. "What were you thinking?" Sarah cried, dropping to her knees beside Emily's wheelchair. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" "I'm fine," Emily said quickly, though she knew her words wouldn't calm them. The bear could have killed you," James snapped, his voice trembling with anger and relief. "What were you even doing out here?" "I was sketching," Emily said defensively, holding up the drawing. "It wasn't going to hurt me. It sat with me, like it trusted me." Her parents stared at her, disbelief and frustration warring on their faces. "Emily, this isn't a game," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "That thing isn't your friend. It's a wild animal." "It's more than that," Emily insisted, her own voice rising. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like it knows me, like it's supposed to be here." James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "Emily, you don't understand what you're risking. We almost lost you once. Do you think we want to go through that again?" Tears pricked Emily's eyes at the harshness of his words, but she refused to back down. "You didn't lose me," she said quietly, "and you're not going to. The bear isn't dangerous. It's different." Her parents didn't respond, their expressions a mix of fear, anger, and something else, something like doubt. Finally, James sighed and stepped back, his shoulders slumping. "Let's go back to the cabin," he said, his voice heavy. "We'll talk about this later." Emily nodded reluctantly, clutching her sketchbook to her chest as they turned back toward the trail. But as they walked, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, hoping for one last glimpse of the bear. It didn't appear, but she felt its presence, as though it was still watching, waiting. She didn't know what the connection meant or why it had chosen her, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of their story. The drive home from Yellowstone was unusually quiet. Sarah and James sat in the front seats, their faces tense as the miles ticked by. Emily, seated in the back with her sketchbook open, gazed out the window, lost in thought. Baxter rested his head on her lap, his presence a small comfort in the lingering awkwardness between her and her parents. The tension from their confrontation in the woods still lingered, hanging over them like a heavy cloud. Emily wasn't upset with them. She understood their fear. She could only imagine how terrifying it must have been for them to find her alone in the forest with the grizzly bear. But she couldn't shake the frustration of feeling misunderstood. To her, the bear wasn't just a wild animal. It was something more profound, something she couldn't quite put into words. And now, as they left Yellowstone behind, she felt a pang of sadness, as though she were leaving a part of herself in those woods. Her sketchbook sat open on her lap, displaying the drawing of the bear she had made during their encounter. It was one of her best works, detailed and alive, capturing not just the bear's physical form but its spirit. She traced the lines with her fingers, feeling the connection she had experienced all over again. She knew she couldn't keep the story to herself. This wasn't just her experience. It was something bigger, something the world needed to hear. The idea began to take root as they drove, growing with every passing mile. By the time they arrived home, Emily had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this experience fade into memory. She was going to share it, no matter how vulnerable or misunderstood it made her feel. The first step was to show her parents what she had been working on. That evening, while Sarah unpacked in the kitchen and James sorted through the camping gear in the garage, Emily quietly set her sketchbook on the dining table. She had gone through every page, arranging her drawings from the trip in chronological order, with the bear sketches at the center. When Sarah walked in and saw the open sketchbook, she froze. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her tone cautious. Emily looked up from her wheelchair, her voice steady. "I wanted to show you. These are the drawings I did on the trip." Sarah hesitated before sitting down, her eyes scanning the sketches. James soon joined them, his brow furrowed as he glanced between Emily and the open book. Together, they turned the pages, taking in the detailed landscapes, the wildflowers, and the animals Emily had captured with such care. And then they reached the drawings of the bear. James' breath caught. The first was the one she had drawn in the meadow after their initial encounter. The second was from the cabin, showing the bear bathed in moonlight. And the third, the one that left them speechless, was the sketch from the forest, so lifelike it seemed as though the bear might step off the page. "You drew these while," Sarah trailed off, her voice faltering. Emily nodded. "While it was with me." Her parents exchanged a look, their expressions softening. For the first time since the trip, they seemed to truly see what the experience had meant to her. "It's incredible," James said quietly, his voice tinged with awe. "It's not just the drawings," Emily said, her eyes meeting theirs. "It's what the bear made me feel. It wasn't just about me. It was about something bigger. That bear wasn't dangerous. It was curious, maybe even trusting. And I think people need to know that." Sarah frowned. "Emily, I understand what you're saying, but people can't just trust wild animals. You were lucky." "It's not about trust," Emily replied, her tone firm. "It's about respect. That's what I felt when I was with the bear. I felt like it was telling me something about how we're supposed to coexist." James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "What are you thinking of doing?" he asked. Emily hesitated, suddenly unsure how her parents would react to her plan. But she took a deep breath and said, "I want to share my story. I want people to understand how important it is to protect wildlife. I've been looking at these drawings, and I think they could help. They could show people what I felt." Sarah's brow furrowed in concern. "Emily, putting yourself out there like that, it might be risky. People might not understand." "They don't have to understand," Emily said softly. "But I can't keep it to myself. If it can make even one person care about wildlife, it'll be worth it." With her parents' reluctant support, Emily began working on her project. She scanned her sketches, pairing them with written reflections about the moments they captured. She described the quiet beauty of Yellowstone, the thrill of seeing the grand prismatic spring, and, most importantly, her encounters with the bear. She poured her heart into her words, writing about the connection she had felt and the lessons she had taken from it. Her parents helped her reach out to local conservation groups, and to their surprise, one of them responded with enthusiasm. They invited Emily to share her story at a small community event focused on wildlife preservation. It was a chance to speak, to show her art, and to advocate for the protection of animals like the bear that had inspired her. The night of the event, Emily sat nervously in her wheelchair as the room filled with people. Her parents stood nearby, their faces a mixture of pride and worry. Baxter sat at her side, his tail wagging gently as if sensing her nerves. When it was her turn to speak, Emily wheeled herself to the front of the room, her sketchbook resting on a stand beside her. She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But when she looked out at the crowd, she saw curiosity in their faces. It gave her the courage to begin. "My name is Emily," she started, her voice steady but soft. "And this summer, I had an experience that changed the way I see the world." She told them about Yellowstone, about the beauty of the park, and the encounters that had left her forever changed. She described the bear, how it had approached her without fear, how it had looked at her with a kind of understanding she couldn't explain. And as she spoke, she showed her sketches, letting the audience see the story through her eyes. "I know it might sound strange," she said, her voice growing stronger, "but I think that bear was trying to show me something. It wasn't just about me, it was about all of us. about how we share this world with animals that are just as much a part of it as we are. The room was silent as she finished her final sketch, a close-up of the bear's eyes, displayed on the screen behind her. Then, slowly, the applause began, building into a standing ovation that left her breathless. In the weeks that followed, Emily's story spread. Her sketches and words were shared online, reaching people far beyond her small community. Conservation groups began reaching out, asking her to speak at their events or share her art for their campaigns. Her connection with the bear became a symbol, a reminder of the delicate balance between humans and nature and the importance of protecting it. Through it all, Emily never forgot the quiet moments in the forest, the way the bear had trusted her enough to sit beside her as she sketched. It wasn't just a memory, it was a mission, one she would carry with her for the rest of her life.